All right, so let's get started. This is the advanced training session going over workflows. My name is Zach Crittenden. I'm the product manager for the content management platform, Adobe Experience Manager, and we're going to be going through workflows. In this session, we'll look at some of the general features of workflows, go through some specific use cases, demonstrate those use cases, and then give you some exercises that you can follow yourself. To understand workflows, first it's good to understand what they're for. So the most important thing that they do is control publishing. So essentially that means that they let you give us ways to control what our external customers see. And second thing that they do is allow us to control destructive actions. So if an author is going to do anything with a page that's maybe an external customer isn't seeing, but still might be something that's disruptive, such as deleting, moving, or archiving, it gives us a way to control both who can do that, what process they have to go through for initiating the process and getting approval, and making sure that any other technical steps that need to be covered are able to be covered. So the huge benefits of workflows are that different groups of people can have different permissions. So a basic author role can create and edit content, but typically does not have permission to publish or do something destructive without that workflow going through an approval of someone who has more permissions. Second important thing is allows sequenced integrations of user actions and system actions. So certain things that you do, for example, publishing a page involves not just making the page available to our end users, but synchronizing that data with some of our analytics databases and calling other systems to potentially check the content or notify them that that content is being published. So workflows give you a way to allow all those steps to happen in the correct sequence. And then the last benefit is that they give you an audit trail, so you can see who took what action and when they did it and what they did. Now, some of the drawbacks from the out-of-the-box workflow features from Adobe, the UI is a little bit kludgy, and so our current workflows have a bit of an over-reliance on email. So we'll cover in this presentation what you can do to tame the email overflow there. We also have some workflows that may seem superfluous, for example, moving or renaming a version. This is because some of these things like moving or renaming have a technical requirement that the user be allowed to delete, and we're most cautious about delete, less cautious about renaming, but in order to rename, Adobe ends up deleting the content and sort of recreating it, and as a consequence, we have to use workflows for things that in theory shouldn't require workflow. And then the last issue is that there are a couple different ways you can initiate and complete workflows in AEM. Unfortunately, there's some bugs in the current version of AEM 5.6 that take some of the customizations you make to a workflow in one area and essentially make those customizations not work correctly in other areas. So we'll go through some of those caveats as well. Many of these are addressed in AEM 6.1, which is currently in QA, and we hope to deploy before the end of Q4 in fiscal year 16. So basically August at the absolute latest. All right, so most workflows have two major steps. And this is how they exist today. Workflows are very flexible, customizable. We can do more with them in the future, but this is generally speaking how most of them work today. First step is initiation, which has two sub-steps. The first step would be to actually start the workflow. The second step would be to comment or do some configuration on the workflow. The second step is approval, and that has an optional ability to comment. Now, behind the scenes, though, there are many, many other steps that happen in a workflow. So I'll show you here what a workflow looks like behind the scenes. So this is the activation workflow, request for activation. So you can see that when it starts, the first thing it does is it checks the payload, or what the thing is that's being activated. So this means that essentially if you are activating a page versus an image, we can go through different steps here. Next step is dynamic route. So this is one of those system integrations where we check to make sure that the page is not currently in use, the URL is not currently in use. Call page registry to make sure that the analytics integration works correctly, and then lock the page. So this is an important thing for authors to note. When a page is going through a workflow, it will get locked. This is a good thing. It means that you can't edit the page while it's going through publication, because if you did edit it, those edits would actually end up getting published, which probably isn't what you want to have happen. The downside is that if you don't complete the workflow, you might leave a page locked and stuck so that other people can't get in and edit it. Then you have email gets sent. This is the first step. Go back to the presentation here. So basically, start workflow starts here. Initiator comment happens here. And then you can see the rest. I won't go through the rest of these in too much detail. You can see it goes down then to this second step here of approval, gets the marketing approval. And then there's a few more steps that it goes through in terms of actually activating the page, unlocking it, rechecking some of the technical detail, and sending a final email to confirm that everything happened. So this is an example of a fairly straightforward process, actually. Now, these are some of the other workflows that we have here. I'll show you the move page. It's an interesting alternative. So one of the other things that workflows do, in addition to going through these sequence steps, is they can go down different pathways depending on sort of what the correct thing to do is in a certain situation. So, so in this case, for example, if you're trying to move a page or rename it, there's a check that happens verifying the new name or path that you're trying to move it to. If everything works fine, then you would go through the straight to the approval step. If there's occasionally there's a need to check the dynamic routes. So if the page is using dynamic routes, it would check dynamic routes before going to the approval step. And then I think in this case, there is no approval required if the page is not currently activated. So this is a feature that a lot of people requested because they might be creating a page or experimenting and having to go through an approval process even when the page is not something that any customer is seeing or is that important, can be very annoying. So this allows you to essentially skip these other steps if the page is not currently active. And then you can see after it goes down one of these branching pathways, it all comes back to these common set of steps of essentially some technical pre-steps, moving the page, and then sending a confirmation email. So those are a couple examples of workflows. If you would like to see more, you can click on these links in the presentation. And as I said, these are the workflows that are most of the authors use in production today. So in terms of initiating workflows, there's 3 places that you can work on workflows. The Sidekick, so I'll show you that first. So this is called the Sidekick. This is a page that I've opened for editing. And if you click on this last tab here, it says Workflow, and you can see those options that I was showing you in the previous screen listed here. So this is the most common way to start a workflow here. The other place that you can do it is in the site admin. So if you need to delete multiple pages or activate multiple pages, for example, that's usually the best place to do it. So to initiate a workflow from the site admin, you just have to make sure, so if you click on the left page column viewer here, you'll notice that the workflow button is not enabled. You have to select a page over here in order for that to become enabled. So once I select this, you can see that now this button is enabled, and same set of workflow options are available here as well. So as I mentioned before, if you wanted to activate multiple pages, for example, you can shift click to select multiple pages, and then you could actually do that same workflow on all of these pages. Last place is the inbox. So if you click on this little icon here in the top middle, it says inbox. This is what that page looks like. If you click on it, it would show you any workflows that you currently have in progress. So you can't really use the inbox to start a workflow, but if you had a bunch of workflows running, this is the best place to go in and complete all the workflows because you can see them all in one place. So those are the best places to go to different workflows. Now, one last important thing to mention, coming back to how we mentioned some bugs between Inbox and Sidekick. So if you have a workflow that requires some kind of input, like the move workflow, you have to initiate it from the Sidekick. So to show you that quickly, I'll show you this move workflow, move page workflow here. I'll click Start, page loads, and now we have this initiator comment step. When I hit complete here, you'll see that this asks me for the move to, so if I did content, QuickBooks, Yen, US, OA, etc. So this is basically how you can determine where a page gets moved to. Now, if I were to look at the same workflow in the inbox, so you can see this page now shows up in the inbox. Oops, didn't mean to do that. If I hit complete here, I get the same dialogue. I get a dialogue, but I don't have the option to enter a path. So the move workflow obviously won't work correctly if you don't tell the system where you want to move the page to. And so as you can see, for certain move workflows like move, you would need to complete this step from the Sidekick. That's the only place that it works correctly. And then one last thing to mention is when if I reload this page here, you'll actually see that this page, this little icon here, shows that that has a workflow in process. And so if you were to try to initiate a workflow from the site admin on a page that already has a workflow in process, it will give you this error letting you know that there's already a workflow happening. And that means that you basically can't do anything to that page from this view. You'd have to do it from the Sidekick. Okay. So in terms of typical use cases, we have pretty good documentation on our training and online help wiki here. So this is the page, main page that's linked here. So you can see here an overview. Some of the information I've already mentioned is described here. And we have an overview of each of the workflows. Gives you a sense of kind of what the workflow does, how it works, any important things that you need to know. And then most of these also have a very detailed step-by-step set of instructions. So the request for activation, for example, or if I look at the move workflow, this goes through quite a bit of detail step-by-step in how to get to the workflow, how to select it, any information you need to configure, shows you the dialogues, other things that you can do, and also shows you visually how to confirm that a workflow has been completed. So I think for most of your typical use cases, that's your best place to go and look. What we're going to do in the rest of this presentation session is go through some of the less desirable use cases where something went wrong. Maybe you need to troubleshoot. Maybe you don't really know what went wrong, just you know something's wrong. Some cases you actually know exactly what you did wrong, you just need help fixing it. And in other cases, someone else maybe did something wrong You know what it is, but you need help fixing it. So we're going to go through those here in a minute. So first, in terms of figuring out what went wrong, this is where the email becomes very important. So I'll show you my inbox here real quick. So I have a couple things here worth mentioning is I have a set of rules. I have a lot of rules in Outlook. But I'll show you this one for email real quick here. Okay, it looks like that just, there we go. Thought I might have crashed Outlook there for a moment. All right, so, okay, let's try this again. Okay, so if I find this AEM, notify AEM, all right. So you can see here, this rule basically looks for anything from CMT ops CQ at Intuit.com, and it moves it to a specific folder. So that can be handy just because as you go through typical workflows, you can get a lot of notifications. It lets you put them all in one place, both so that you don't miss out on any other important business emails because you have this big flood of email from AEM. Also, if you do have issues or want to look at the progress of things, it's good to be able to go and see them all in one place. This is the folder where I send all that stuff to. And you can see here these steps that have gone through. So if we look, let's see here. So actually, we can see the workflow I was just demonstrating. I got an email for. So you can see the CQ notification, moving page, initiator comment. So typically the workflow that's happening and the step that's happening will be described in the subject line of the email, and then in the body of the email you get a lot of useful details. So it will tell you where this was happening. Most of this is going to be in production for you, but there are occasions where pages, someone may be testing something in pre-production or QA and you get emails. This is a good thing to look at. It shows you exactly which pages are being worked on, and also tells you what has happened. This also shows you references. So in this case, this page that I'm trying to move references a couple of other pages, and so that can help you see, for example, if you're moving a header or footer or an image or something that's shared by a lot of different pages, can let you know kind of the scope of impact you might be having. So that can be super helpful. At a very high level, if you're trying to tell apart normal things versus problematic things, the simple thing to do is to look at the subject line. So usually if something went wrong, you'll have a subject line that contains the word failed. And if things are going well, usually you get something that says CQ notification. So just as an example of that, I'll search this for subject. Failed. Okay, and you can see it looks like it's been a while since something failed. That's actually great to see. Looks like back in October there was a page that was being published, and there was route checking issue. So as you can see here, this tells you exactly who initiated the workflow, what the issue was, and often tells you what you can do to fix it. So for example, in this case, this page that I'm trying to publish here, or this is the dynamic route that's having an issue. This is the page that I was trying to activate, and this is the page that it is in conflict with. So usually this gives you enough information to go ahead and fix whatever the issue is. A couple other things that you can do to figure out what's going on is, number 2 is to look at the workflow report. So I'll go ahead and copy this URL here, or actually copy this example. Go back to the browser. Okay, and so this shows you all the history of a workflow. So you can see here this page was last activated about a month ago, who initiated the workflow, and then what steps it went through. So one important thing to note with this report is the difference between assignee and user. So user is almost always a specific person in this case, Adrian Jacob. Oftentimes, though, the assignee is not going to be that specific user. So, for example, due to the permissions restrictions, that this specific user is not allowed to register a page and replicate a page from one server to another, et cetera, et cetera. So by this user requesting it, though, the system is actually able to go through and execute all of these steps. There are a few steps where you'll see the name in both places. And that's basically any of the places where that user is giving input. So this can show you, that this user initiated the workflow. They also completed the comment step, and then they also completed the approval step. One other thing to mention here is groups. So the approval very rarely goes to a single individual. Usually it goes to a group. So in this case, it's the QuickBooks Great Britain Approvers Group, of which Adrian is a member. So because Adrian's a member, he's able to see these items and operate on them. But it is going to a group, so if there are other users there, they can go through this. So this can be really helpful if something goes wrong. Something got activated that shouldn't have been activated, something got moved or renamed that shouldn't have been moved. You can use this to figure out exactly when that happened and who was involved in doing that. So this is a super, super helpful report. Definitely recommend you play around with it a little bit and understand how it works. Last but not least, there's a way to check workflow instances. So I will go into this here. So I'll show you the wiki page for that briefly, and then also show you the workflow. So this shows all of the workflows. This is way more information than you need. So if you come to this screen here, make sure you click on instances. So you can see at this point in time, I don't have any workflows running, but if I had completed that move workflow, for example, you would actually see that running here. So if there's ever a workflow that you start, you initiate, but you decide that you actually don't want to complete that workflow, it would show up here. And when you select the workflow, you would be able to click on the Terminate button and prevent that workflow from completing further. So these are instructions here on how to get to this page, what you would see there, and basically shows you kind of step-by-step what you need to go through to terminate a workflow. Okay, so that kind of covers basic troubleshooting. If you're not quite sure what's going wrong, you need to look into it more and potentially figure out what actions you need to take. If you know you did something wrong, oftentimes you can resolve it basically by looking here, reading the email, and basically reading what it tells you went wrong and how to fix it. One other really important thing to mention proactively is the importance of prevention. So versions are a very powerful feature to basically save your work at various points. So before making a big edit to a page, potentially before or after publishing a big change to a page, it's very helpful to create an edit version so that you can go back to what a page looked like previously without having to manually re-edit it to look like what it looked like before. So to show you, this is pretty well described on the CMS wiki, so I won't go into too much detail here, but just to show that at a very high level, I'll go to this page here. And if I go to same thing in the Sidekick tab right next to workflows is versioning. You can see this is the place you'd go to create a version. If you click on Restore Version, it will show you all of the prior versions. I will go ahead here, version for demo, CMS Advanced Demo. Okay, hit Create Version, and you can see here revision 1.0 created for QB pricing. Second, let's say another version created for demo. Create version, and you can see revision 1.1. Now when I click on restore version, I can see these two options here. So by hovering, you can see the system automatically assigns it a label, which is that version number 1.0, 1.1. And you can see when I hover over it, you can also see the text that I typed in. So it's very helpful to make sure you enter text when you're creating versions to help you know which version is actually the one that you want to restore. All right, so one other important thing to mention is that due to those permissions issues I mentioned earlier relating to how people can do destructive actions, unfortunately restoring a version goes through a process in AEM that can be destructive. And so most users do not have permissions to this restore button. So if I click this here, if I try to restore this way, I get an error, unable to restore version. So this is a situation in which you would need to, actually I should need to terminate this workflow before I can do that. But there is a workflow for restoring versions, and that's pretty well covered again in the wiki here, restore page version. So I won't go through that in too much detail. It goes through the steps I was just showing you here in terms of labels and text that you might type in. Shows you go to the workflow tab, restore version. Most important thing to mention here is the version that you type in is just the number that you would see in the left-hand column here. So in the example I was just showing, I would probably restore version 1.0, and then you can go through this workflow to restore versions. Okay. A couple other, these are, so previous slides were sort of the more general use cases you'd see. These are some of the most common mistakes that we tend to see and how to resolve them. So if you published an unfinished page, maybe there was a typo or something that, some content hadn't been fully filled in yet, and you need to roll back. The steps you go through there would be to restore version. So go to a version prior to the edits that are unfinished, and then after you restore, this is very important, you have to do request for activation. So the versioning is only happening in the authoring environment. In order to affect what end users see, you have to go through an activation workflow of whatever version is currently active in the authoring environment. And then, this would be kind of the best case for this scenario. If you, for some reason, don't have a version created, even as hard as we try to remember to create versions, sometimes we don't always remember to do that. So the only other real option in those situations is to manually edit the page back to its desired state. Occasionally, if it's a very major disruptive issue, it may be worth reaching out to myself or Hong Zhang or someone else on the CMS platform team. There may be backup we could restore from the previous day, but for the most part, these are the two options. Similar steps you should go through in case you accidentally delete a part of a page. Again, restore the version, and the one that isn't quite as self-service as if you accidentally delete a page. Now, it's fairly hard to accidentally delete a page because you do have to go through a delete workflow, but there are times when you maybe meant to delete one thing and accidentally deleted another. So we do have a backup that's made of all of our production content every day, roughly around 3 a.m. Pacific time. So typically we can go to that backup and restore that version of the page. This is not an incremental backup though, so if for some reason you don't realize it, this backup gets replaced every 24 hours. So it's definitely important that you make sure you get back to us as quickly as you can when you notice something right, to make sure that we have a chance of restoring from that backup. All right. Last scenario is use cases where someone else maybe did something wrong. So if you are ever working on a page, it's very common to be working on a site with other users, and you may not, something may have happened, you need to figure out what happened. This is definitely the time and place to use the workflow report. As I showed before here, this is the easiest way to figure out everything that's happened with the page and kind of the whole history of everything that's been going on. One other thing that you can do, maybe before you go to the workflow report, is just look at the page in the site admin. So as you can see here in this case, you can, shows you the current status of a workflow. This has the move page workflow happening. Similar, if I were to, let's say, open a page and then lock it, that would be another thing that you could see. Go in here to, let's say I want to lock a page for some reason. That's another thing that you can see here. And again, by hovering over the lock icon, you can see which user has it locked. If you ever have issues with something that someone else has done, obviously the first step is to try to get in contact with that person, make sure that that you understand what they're doing. Maybe that they have a very totally valid reason for it being locked, and you don't want to actually do anything about that until they're done doing whatever it is that they need to do. If there have been instances where someone may have a page locked and then they go on vacation or something like that, so in those cases you can contact Hong Zhang or Zach Crittenden or an administrator of the AAM platform, and we can go in and override or unlock that for you if that person is not able to do that. All right. This pretty much is what I just said there. If your page is locked or in a workflow, you can follow these steps to figure it out and take action on it. This is the question: as an approver, can I cancel another approver's workflow? So one thing that happens, people are confused about the distinction between an admin and an approver. Pretty much there are only a handful of admins for AAM, and that's because admins have a lot of power to do a lot of things across the platform. So most likely you are an approver, not an admin. That's just a terminology clarification. As an approver, then it's important to know that if you can see the workflow instance in the console, then you do have permission to terminate it. So I was showing you earlier this workflow instance, set of workflow instances here. Actually, let me go back here. So there is in the inbox, you'll see that there's actually an item that is currently in workflow here. That's not showing up in my instances, and that's because there's another user who requested and initiated that workflow. And so in that case, I'm actually not able to see that here or terminate it. Now, if I were to, but the workflow that I created, I can come here and terminate. So I'll go ahead and terminate that, reload the page, and verify that. So now at this point, there are no workflows here. And if I refresh this page here, I should see, that workflow icon disappeared. But I'm not able to, you can see that workflow disappeared, but I'm not able to cancel this workflow. So basically, for the most part, approvers are not able to terminate other approvers' workflows unless you're part of the same group or you are the person who initiated the workflow. All right. Last question. Very common to try to start a workflow and then basically nothing happens. So in that scenario, you may be on a page like this. You go to workflows, you select the workflow, and you click start, and then the page just blinks straight back to looks like nothing happened. So in that case, this is where it is a little bit good to know that these steps happen. Typically what happens is in one of these steps, it was identified that there's something wrong in the workflow, that it's not going to allow it to proceed, and the workflow will end immediately. So in that scenario, you don't really need to come here. You don't need to know what these things are. If you just go to the emails that are sent, you should be able to pretty quickly figure out pretty much every instance an email will get sent, and from the email you should be able to figure out why nothing happened when you try to initiate the workflow. All right. Okay, so I think we covered this pretty well in terms of rolling back and terminating workflows. I think we visually showed some of the behind the scenes of a workflow, but I'll go ahead and go through one of these exercises here, and then these are exercises that we would definitely recommend that you practice yourself on the training server. Can't overemphasize the importance of practicing these workflows yourself. The reason being that most of the major issues that we see are late at night when something very important is happening, and a user is trying to move a page as part of setup for a promotion, or schedule activation as part of a setup for a new product launch, and that's when things seem to go wrong. Murphy's Law at work. So we definitely recommend that you try these pretty thoroughly, make sure you really understand them well in either the training server or in production on pages that are not going to live traffic, so that you understand all the steps of the workflow, how they work, how to terminate them, so that when you really need things to work well, you're not learning something for the first time. So going through an example of scheduled activation, I will walk through the steps here. Let's do this with, go ahead and do that with this page here. So scheduled activation, this is one of those items where you would do a normal request for activation workflow start, and then in the initiator comment step, you get an option of a time and date to publish it. So you'll notice here that if you don't put a time and date, it publishes immediately. That's the more common use case if you just want to activate something immediately. But let's say that we have a special promo happening that is going to launch today, April 5th, and is going to launch at, let's say right now is 3:50 p.m. Pacific time. I'll set this to start at 4 o'clock Pacific time. Demo scheduled activation. All right, hit OK. And then you can see this workflow goes into the state subject workflow request or activation. So most of our workflows after the initiation step have a 1-minute sort of pause timer built into them. Reason being, there were some issues with going through these workflow steps and having one step a step lower down complete before a step higher up had completed. And so we put the pausing step in here to just ensure that everything happens in the correct sequence. That's a little voiceover of why we're waiting here for a second. If I look at my inbox now, you can see it's still not showing up here. If I look at the sidekick here, it's still not showing up here. So typically, you can wait for a minute or so and then come back and check the timer here. Okay, so actually that looks like went fairly quickly. Now see that marketing approval is shown up here. And if I reload the inbox, I should also see that this page has now shown up in my inbox ready for approval. So this is a step that I can actually complete in either location. I could hit complete here and get the option to do it here, or I could complete it here. so I'll just go ahead and complete it here because that's where I'm at. So completing demo scheduled activation. Okay. And you can see my mouse is loading a little bit. It should be reloading the page here. Okay, and now you see that the step that it's in is waiting for activation. So this is interesting thing to note about scheduled workflows is that part of the way that they work is by essentially pausing the item in your inbox. You can see here, this page here right now is in marketing approval. If I refresh it though, you should see that now it's in the state of waiting for activation. So if I, for this page, it's going to stay in this step basically until the appointed time occurs. If you are interested in what that time is, you can look in the page properties and it will show you when that activation has been scheduled. So, so this page should be good to go. I won't stretch the demo out another 7 minutes in order to wait for that to happen. But once the scheduled time hits, the activation would complete, and this page would no longer show up as waiting for activation and no longer show up in my inbox. So that completes this demo. As I mentioned before, I highly recommend you go through the wiki page instructions and try out some of these other exercises yourself in the training server. And that is the end of the presentation. Since this is a re-recording, we do not have any questions, or we don't have anybody to ask questions of us. But if you do have any questions, please feel free to reach out to Zach Crittenden, myself, or Chris Augustine, our trainer, or Hong Zhang, or anyone else on the marketing platform team. Thank you very much.